You're listening to David Hewson, today talking about the return of a legendary French detective, Baptiste.
Baptiste lit his seventh disco bleu of the morning and cast his eyes over the guillotine. There were only 2 or 3 still working in the whole of France. This one, a warder told him, was shipped by truck from Dijon 3 days before. The man who held the title of chief executioner had arrived early that morning and left it to a couple of workmen to assemble in the prison courtyard. It was smaller than Baptiste expected, perhaps because the only images he'd seen before were in history books. Marie Antoinette and the victims of the terror meeting their hands on a public platform, severed heads, held high by a triumphant sans-culotte to amuse a cheering crowd. There was no stage for the rudimentary mechanism that was meant to take the life of Gilles Mailloux. No sense of theatre or much of an audience, though a small crowd of protesters had begun to assemble outside the high jail gates, calling for an end to state executions, singing songs, kneeling on the grubby cobbles and saying prayers. Capital punishment was rare, and probably soon to be abandoned given slow shifts in public opinion. Mailloux might be its last victim, in no small part due to his bizarre behavior in court. That and Baptiste's dogged handiwork in the case of the missing Noémie Augustin, raped and murdered at Mailloux's hand, the court decided, not that they yet had a body. He couldn't take his eyes off the guillotine.
That was the wonderful Checky Cario, Julien Baptiste on TV, narrating the start of Baptiste, The Blade Must Fall, a mystery, a crime story set mostly in the northern France of the mid-1970s, but also the return of one of the more memorable TV detectives of recent years, first seen in The Missing, and later with his own 2 series that have run all around the world. A decent man in his mid to late 60s, troubled but kind, and somehow obsessed with helping those whose relatives have vanished in curious circumstances. At least that's the Baptiste you may know. But what was he like when he was young? Who is Baptiste, really? Where does that obsession come from? Those were the challenges I faced when writing this book, an original novel based on the character Checky brought to life so brilliantly, not to produce another episode of the Baptiste we know, but to discover what he was like 4 decades before, facing the strange dark case that would set him on the path to become the man we meet later. A decade ago, I adapted the Killing series in Copenhagen into book form. It was a fascinating challenge, but in that case, the stories and Sarah Lunt were there already, though they changed somewhat in the process. Baptiste, the young Baptiste, was a blank page, taking an established TV character in his 60s, then rolling back the years. How could I refuse? Where on earth did I begin? Now, I'm not a fan of pouring words into a blank screen in the hope that at some stage you'll find out what it is you want to write. I never approach any project without thinking it through a bit first, and one like this especially so. I started methodically rewatching The Missing and the Baptiste series, principally to try to jot down notes about Julien's personality and his relationship with his adored English wife Celia. A page of character notes, and then came a tougher task. I decided to set the story around the time Baptiste was 26, a rising detective in the police back in the France of the 1970s. In 1976, I was a reporter on a small-time local newspaper in southern England. I'd never set foot in France. I doubt I even had a passport. This was European history that was a complete blank to me. Reading and reading, I came to the conclusion it wasn't a particularly notable era at all. The unrest and violence of the 1968 student riots was over. The old France of de Gaulle was beginning to fade as the country slowly transitioned from its immediate and rather stuffy post-war identity to a more liberal modern state. But then I came across a grim fact that made my heart stop. In a minute or so, I went from wondering how on earth I could tackle a story like this, whether it was even possible, to knowing what would prove the spark. It was a simple, bleak discovery. There was still one shocking hangover from the pre-war France of old, the guillotine. To my horror and amazement, the French judicial system would still sentence murderers to the bloody instrument of death that had been seen so frequently and so brutally during the French Revolution 2 centuries before. It seldom happened, and only in the nastiest of cases, but it happened right up to 1977 and in public too until 1939. Sometimes, more rarely than one might hope, book ideas pop straight out at you, from a news story, something you see in the street, or, as was the case here, an article I came across on a website. Straight away I thought, what would a decent man like Baptiste, surely someone who believed capital punishment was brutal, archaic and quite unnecessary, think if he brought a suspect to court on a murder charge, expecting him to receive the usual life sentence, only for the man in the dock to behave so bizarrely he receives the ultimate sentence, the guillotine. But let's go one step further. What if that same condemned prisoner, on the day he's either going to be executed or reprieved by the Élysée Palace and given a life sentence, asks to see Baptiste and starts to talk in a roundabout, cryptic way about the events that led him to face the court, events in which Baptiste was personally involved, meeting those concerned, the man in front of him in jail too, someone Baptiste initially believed to be a decent and helpful aid in the search for the missing girl at the heart of the story. Then, as the conversation continues, Baptiste is appalled as he begins to realize the man he placed in the dock, the individual on the point of being taken to the guillotine just a short walk away, might be innocent. All conventional narratives need a what-if, and there was mine. For me, there are 3 important pillars on which every conventional narrative sits: the world that encompasses the story, the characters who inhabit that world, and the events that come to challenge those people as the tale develops. The world always comes first for me, and I already had that key fact about 1970s France that sparked the initial idea: the prospect of the guillotine for the darkest of murderers, especially those involved in what is assumed to be kidnapping for sexual gratification and murder. That's a start, but a world needs a location, real or fictional. It already occurred to me, watching the way the older TV Baptiste navigates Europe, that he's a city man, used to the rush and bustle of the metropolis. In my head, I quickly came to realize he was a Parisian, with all the customary attitudes that come with those who grow up in capital cities: a touch of arrogance, a feeling of superiority, a belief that the big city almost always knows best. The same goes for Londoners too, I should say, before anyone accuses me of picking on Parisians. Should the story be set in Paris? I consider that, but not for long, for 2 reasons. The first is simply practical. This was a story about Baptiste and what made him the man he was. Setting it in Paris seemed a distraction. The second reason was more important. If Baptiste was working in Paris, he was on his own turf, comfortable, at home with the resources at his disposal, presumably working with a team of people he knew and maybe trusted, maybe didn't. This felt too close to one of those crime stories that, let's be honest, borrow from soap operas, where there's a settled ensemble cast of characters we all hope readers will come to know and love or hate. No criticism of them, they're very popular and I've written some myself. But that's not this book. I repeat, it's about Baptiste and the origins of his obsession with missing people. It seemed to me to make far more sense if I took him out of his comfortable, settled environment in Paris and placed him somewhere he didn't know, somewhere the locals mistrusted him, as they often did with Parisians, somewhere he was the archetypal stranger in a strange land. Also, I felt Baptiste was more a lone wolf than a team player, though perhaps he didn't like to think of himself that way. A man more comfortable being left to his own devices than being told what to do by his superiors. Not Paris then, but where? I usually set my stories in real cities: Venice, Amsterdam, Copenhagen. This time round, I decided to branch out and create a completely fictional location. It's called Clermier, a small town in northern France, Picardy or the Pas-de-Calais roughly. Half of it old, elegant and wealthy. Then, on the other side of the fictional Chaume River, there's a sink estate where the underclass live, hand-to-mouth some of them, a few on the edge of the law. This is an area of northern France that's been somewhat deprived for decades, a place of failed mining communities and agricultural areas given over to sugar beet farming, the last place a Parisian would feel at home, and somewhere Baptiste would find himself regarded with suspicion from the outset when he turns up on a temporary posting alongside an equally out-of-place colleague from Marseille, Etienne Fatoussi. Clermier is somewhere the rest of the country has mostly forgotten. It's got a small police station, an established class system of us and them, little in the way of crime, detected anyway, and a local gentry who control pretty much everything, including a charity, Les Amis dans l'Adversité, Friends in Adversity, who give a little to the poor from time to time. It's somewhere that likes being unnoticed, with good reason, and is determined to crush anyone who wishes to question the status quo. I tried to make Clermier as real a place as one can with somewhere you've invented. It was a delight to meet Checky in London just before he began recording the audiobook, and an even greater delight when he told me he found Clermier so convincing he'd Googled it, thinking the town was real and he simply had never heard of it. The story doesn't stay in Clermier all the time. It steps out into the wider France, to the coast and even across the Channel, and Paris too. But that fictional small town in northern France is at the heart of the story. I don't think it could happen anywhere else. A what if then? A world to enclose the narrative and the characters to come. What next? Characters, of course. Julien Baptiste I had pretty much before I began to write a word. I knew the older version of him from Checky's portrayal on the TV. But people are often defined by their families too. I wanted to know more about Julien's own. So he has a mother, Marie, who accompanies him at the outset of his trip. This isn't a particularly friendly act on her part. Julien is without his own car due to an upset in his private life, and Marie's is the only way he can get to his temporary post. The journey and the time she spent with him establish, I hope, where he came from and the rather fragmented life he's led up to this point. He's a cop, of course, so we need other cops. The closest is Etienne Fatoussi, that import from Marseille. A charming, handsome chap, very good with women, keen on wearing his uniform, unlike Baptiste, though he's a little fragile too at times, not that Baptiste notices at first. Then there are the locals. Clermier, as I said, is a small place with not a lot for the little cop shop there to do. Captain Dupont doesn't like outsiders, especially nosy ones from big cities. But he's short of staff, and even though he's very willing to hand off difficult tasks to a neighbouring larger station, he's going to have to put up with Baptiste and Fatoussi for as long as his distant superiors want. On the money side of the town, there's a hierarchy of men, all men, who run everything. The mayor, the priest, the local councillor, and the businessman who's the nearest Clermier has to a local magnate. On the other side of the river is a sprawling, grim concrete estate that's very different. There, a family have recently turned up from Calais, the Augustins, strangers to Clermier who are always mistrusted, especially in this case when the father, Charles, is black, an immigrant with a white wife and a daughter who's taken after him. A 19-year-old young woman, Noemi, currently between jobs, waitressing for the clubhouse of the Ami from time to time, dreaming about escaping the little town and the down-at-heel house her family have been rented by her father's boss, the local businessman. They were a happy family in Calais, but Charles had ideas, ambitions he couldn't realise there. He's been tempted by the expectation of advancement. But at what cost? Soon we'll find out. And then there's the man in the prison cell, a young, impoverished local from the rough side, who's helped Baptiste from the outset. So much our detective grew to like him, and could scarcely believe in the end he was the villain he'd been seeking all along. His name is Gilles Maillot, early 20s, left school with nothing to his name, but self-educated, so that he knows much of the history of Clermier, and a good deal about obscure French literature and poetry too. An interesting fellow. That brings me to the final part of the challenge, events. I'm a stickler for structure in books. I like them to have form, parts, chapters, scenes, a landscape sufficiently recognisable for the reader to understand how to tackle the story, when to read on, when to realise there's a pause in proceedings and maybe take a break. Baptiste has a very specific structure because I wanted it to reflect the pace and feel of a TV series that moves episode by episode, each with its own internal arc, to its conclusion. To this end, the book is divided into 7 parts. Think of them as episodes if you wish. Each begins with a kind of frame scene, Baptiste in Gilles Maillot's cell in prison, next to the yard where they can hear workmen putting the final touches to the assembly of the guillotine. Then we move back to the summer before, in Clermier, the summer of 1976. If you're of a certain age, and I am, you may remember this was one of the hottest on record, back then anyway. Life pretty much came to a halt for many as the temperatures soared to heights few had experienced in Northern Europe, and stayed there for weeks on end. That's what it's like when a young woman called Noémie Augustin finishes her game of tennis with a young Englishman called Daniel Murray, who's lodging in her modest home across the river. Noémie seems concerned about something. Daniel is shyly interested in her. But the game ends, the two part, and she vanishes that evening as Julien Baptiste and his grumpy mother turn up for his temporary assignment in the little police station under Captain Dupont. Modern stories about missing people often entail vast searches, complex police operations and public appeals. Not in the Clermier of 1976. Noémie is a newcomer from the wrong side of the river, and though few are willing to say it, black, which is more than unusual in the quiet, very traditional town. She's also 19, and Dupont is adamant. Teenagers run away, bored with their tedious home life, chasing boyfriends, falling out with them. Usually, he insists, they return of their own accord. Besides, he adds, what evidence does Baptiste have that something untoward has happened? Yes, the parents insist this is completely out of character, but don't all parents think that in such circumstances? How often will they admit there have been tensions and arguments at home that may have led to a girl or boy of 19 deciding to pack their bags and go? But Noémie never packed any bags, never gave anyone any inkling she wanted to flee. Baptiste, a man with a nose for the suspicious, detects there's something wrong in the quiet town from the start. That is not going to endear him to Captain Dupont, who doesn't like smart guys from the city, or anyone who's likely to upset the neat, tidy town he thinks he owns. What if? World, characters, events. The stage is set for Baptiste, the blade must fall. When I saw Checky in London, I took a deep breath and asked the inevitable question, did my version of a young Baptiste accord with his older character? Could he imagine this was what made Julien who he was? Very much so, he said, and I left him the task of turning my words into his story, in that wonderful Gallic voice of his. I hope you enjoy my Julien Baptiste, and if you're a fan of the series, agree with Checky. And if this book is your first experience of this unique French detective, I suggest you track him down in The Missing and the Baptiste series on TV. And here is another taste of Checky continuing the start of the story.
It seemed more like a piece of ancient farm machinery liberated from an agricultural museum than an instrument of death in the employ of the Ministry of Justice. Wooden frame like a giant child's toy, ropes to raise the angled blade, sharpened and shining in the warm winter sun, a low plank bed for the prisoner to lie on, a half-moon cut out for his neck. Maybe there was a wicker basket somewhere, just like they had 2 centuries before during the Terror. There would be blood too, surely. Lots. And waiting in one of the prison storerooms, a cheap pine coffin that would be brought out before the condemned man's final moments. One of the workmen yelled, "Hey, Marcel, here's to you!" He had a cabbage, a big one, green and leafy. He was lobbing it through the air to his colleague. The other man caught it like a rugby player receiving a pass. "Trial run!" he cried, and placed it on the neck rest beneath the shadow of the frame. The other one pulled on the rope. The gleaming blade rose, then locked in position at the summit. "Hey, fais gaffe là, oh!" One quick pull on the lever and they stepped back, laughing, as the keen edge tumbled down with a squeal and screech, slammed into the cabbage, cleaved it in 2. "Bon appétit, eh?" The one who worked the rope picked up half and threw it to his mate.
Baptiste, The Blade Must Fall is out on the 25th of April in print, ebook and audio. Pre-orders open now.